Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're happy to see that we have a great turnout, and thanks for attending. My name is Jerry Blass, and I'm the CEO of ComplyAssistant, and I'm joined by John Gomez, CEO of Sensato, and Ken Ryer, who's Vice President of Operations at ComplyAssistant. ComplyAssistant and Sensato formed an alliance in 2017 to offer collaborative cybersecurity solutions to the healthcare industry. And today we are presenting a core solution called MDCOP Plus, and you can see right on the screen here what it stands for: Medical Device Cybersecurity Operations Program. The webinar is scheduled to run for, let me just clear this panel out, sorry about that. And I'll go back to full screen. So the webinar is scheduled to run for 1 hour, and it is being recorded. All attendees are muted, but can ask questions in the GoToWebinar questions panel, or you can click on the raised hand icon next to your name, and we will unmute you during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will provide links to the PDF and of this PowerPoint and also to the recording. So everyone who registered and attended will get the link to the recording and also the PDF. We also have contact information as provided at the end of this PowerPoint, and we'll show that later on, and you'll see that when you get the PDF as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin with the agenda, introductions, and then we'll do the presentation of MDCOP Plus. That'll be both John and me. We'll start with John. We'll follow that with a quick demo of our audit platform for medical device vendors in ComplyAssistant, and then open it up for Q&A. So to introduce John, for those of you who know John, he really needs no introduction. I met John when Sensato was selected by NJHA and NJHIMSS to run a 2-day cybersecurity tactical simulation event for New Jersey hospitals, and it was an amazing event. Our initial interaction led to discussions about how our companies could collaborate to provide cybersecurity solutions, and that led to the alliance that we formed in 2017. Now, for those of you who don't know John, I have a bio here that I can read, which is an interesting bio. So John has been involved in technology since he was handed the keys to the computer lab in high school. Since that time, John has worked for companies such as American Reinsurance, H&R Block's Advanced Technology Group, WebMD, Eclipsys Allscripts, and others. John started his career in law enforcement, and although technology is his passion, he still works closely with military and law enforcement special operations teams. So with no further ado, let's welcome John.
Hey, Jerry, thank you so much. Okay. So just want to give you a little bit about Sensato, not go into kind of a sales pitch or anything, but just give you some frame of reference for the material that we're going to present to you this afternoon. We started back in 2013. We're a cybersecurity firm specifically focused on the healthcare industry and critical infrastructure. Since that time, we've been very strong advocates of NIST 853. We also have twice been named top 500 most innovative cybersecurity firms in the world. And most recently, we've been named by Cyber Ventures, one of the medical device cybersecurity firms to watch in 2018. We can go to the next slide. So we basically have 3 product lines or 3 offerings. We have MDCOP that we're going to talk a lot about today, and a lot of what we talk about will be just education and best practices that you can employ whether you decide to do something with us or ComplyAssistant or not. The second thing that we have is a Security Operations Center, which we call CTOC. It was the first, and I believe still is the only purpose-built healthcare information technology security operations center. So we operate that out of New Jersey. And then we have our cybersecurity operations platform, which is our Nightingale product. And we'll talk more about those things because they are actually part of the MDCOP offering that we're going to speak about. But with that, let's get to the next slide. And I kind of want to get into some of the things that kind of hopefully give you a sense of the history that we in ComplyAssistant bring to the table in thinking about medical device security and the challenges that are posed to that. So we started as a company doing medical device risk assessments back in 2015. We've learned a lot in doing those, and what we learned in doing those risk assessments is a lot of the reason that we developed the MDCOP program, and I'll go into that a little further as we get through the deck. But the other thing we did, and actually ComplyAssistant was part of this, one of the, I would say, kind of one of the plank members, one of the original members of this group, was we started the Medical Device Cybersecurity Task Force. And so the reason we started that was back in 2016, a lot of talk was happening around what happens with medical device cybersecurity. And there were a lot of discussions around long-term strategic things, but nothing really tactical, not what do you do right now, what are the top 5, 10 things you need to do right now to help secure that medical device infrastructure. We started with, I believe, 3 members, and then that's grown now to about 83 members, which are a composition of hospitals, manufacturers, consultancies. MITRE, who is the official technology research arm of the FDA, is part of the group. The group is an open source group. Anybody can join. You can go to mdctf.org and join. There's no charge. What we do in the group is help distribute best practices and develop collateral and concepts that are quite tactical in nature. So they're short-term kind of quick things you can do, while other organizations like NHISAC and others are thinking more strategically. Most recently, and this is something that we've been working on for quite some time, is we've formed an ISAO. And this ISAO is actually something that the FDA and MITRE asked us to do. So we're converting the task force to an ISAO, and we will continue to partner with ComplyAssistant and drive all the original vision and mission from the task force into the ISAO. Just being an ISAO gives us a much more formal presence, and we'll be signing a memorandum of understanding between us, FDA, and NHISAC. So hopefully what I'm trying to do is just qualify the information we're about to give you, because I think all too often people will present stuff without giving you some context as to, hey, why should you even pay attention to this person? And so we also work very closely with medical device manufacturers. So back in 2016, we started programs around writing secure code and risk assessments specifically for medical device manufacturers. And one of the products that we'll talk about specifically, what ComplyAssistant's doing, really came out of that work that we've done with medical device manufacturers and the challenges they face in securing devices. And we'll talk more about that as well. So next slide. So, what did we kind of learn in terms of doing risk assessments and starting the medical device task force and working with device manufacturers? Well, there was a bunch of things that we learned. The first thing is we found that on average, most medical devices have about 6.2 vulnerabilities per medical device in a hospital. So you can do the math there. If you have 1,000 devices or 70,000, multiply it by 6.2, that's probably an accurate representation of how many vulnerabilities those devices represent. Now, obviously, that's on average, so your numbers may vary a little bit, but that was one of the key findings. And the second thing is we found that about 60%, now this number is getting better over the last year or two, but about 60% of devices are based on end-of-life platforms, meaning versions of Linux or Windows that are no longer supported. Or have just older versions that have been deprecated. And so that's obviously an issue because that means there's no fixes for those versions, and that's one of the reasons we see so many levels of vulnerabilities. We also found that, when we go in and do assessments, typically we find there's no specific and focused medical device cybersecurity policy. And what does that mean? It simply means that, yes, if we go in and look at somebody's risk assessments or cybersecurity policies and privacy policies, they typically have everything they need to meet the HIPAA spirit of the, I don't want to say law, but HIPAA requirements, the spirit of the HIPAA requirements. Or maybe they have high trust, or maybe they've got NIST 853. But when we ask them for, hey, show us your specific policies around securing medical devices, we find most organizations don't have that. And obviously that's a concern from a risk perspective, not so much from HIPAA and a regulatory side maybe, but from a civil liability perspective, that's an issue. And so, that's a common finding. The other thing we found is that, and I think this is one most people know, is that, a great practice around medical devices is segmenting the networks that they live on. And that's obviously for a lot of reasons an expensive proposition, something that most hospitals either can't afford to do or don't have the resources to do. So that's a big challenge as well, is that when we go in and do these risk assessments over the past several years, this is another key finding. Another best practice that comes specifically out of in this world is continuous monitoring. And so when we're talking about things that are connected to humans or involved in diagnostic medicine, continuous monitoring of those devices from a security perspective is important. So this is another area that we would look at coming in to do risk assessments and typically find that no, there is no continuous monitoring. Now that doesn't mean that we don't find IPSs, intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, antivirus, firewalls, and all those other things. But when we ask people, well, are those things monitoring the medical devices? The answer is typically no. And so, that's an issue because, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's organizational, right? The medical or clinical engineering group lives under another, outside of the IT organization, and many times they're spinning up their own networks, or the vendors are spinning up networks. We've heard a lot of that. And so the IT group can't really monitor those devices. Or there's concern, fear that if you do start monitoring, you're going to hurt the devices or cause an issue. We also look for threat intelligence specific to medical devices. You can't really develop policy or best practices if you don't have threat intelligence. Remember, any policy, whether we're talking about medical devices, HIPAA, NIST, HITRUST, whatever it may be, PCI, are all meant to be based on current threat landscape. In fact, when we work with OCR, one of the things that we'll hear them bring up is that these policies are great, but they're dated because they don't deal with current threats. So we look for threat intelligence related specifically to medical devices. And then one of the other things we find is just general best practices and security awareness training specific to medical device security. And what that means is programs in place that allow the people that are working with the medical devices, your biomedical, clinical engineering, depending on what you call it, team members that have been specifically trained to know what to look for in devices that may be showing anomalies or understanding how to interpret that threat intelligence, so that when they're upgrading firmware or dealing with device deployment or evaluating vendors or things of that nature, they understand what to do. So these are typically the things we learn. And this kind of, led us to start wondering, well, if this is what we're seeing all the time, what do we do about it? So we can go to the next slide. So, we kind of came up with, okay, here's some concepts around maybe what you should do if you step back for a moment and look at everything we learned, right? It kind of breaks out to 3 buckets. The first bucket is policy and governance. You need to institute medical device specific policies. The second thing in that kind of category is you have to deploy medical device manufacturer assessment program. Now, what does that mean? Simply stated, that the policy should say that any device coming into the hospital or the healthcare organization should undergo some type of a risk evaluation. That doesn't mean a full-blown risk assessment necessarily, but you should have some type of risk evaluation process. And that means developing some form of questionnaire, some form of policy that says you're not going to bring in any device unless it goes through some form of a risk assessment. Now, you see this a lot with applications, but we don't see it often in a formalized fashion when it comes to medical devices. Now, there's a few reasons for that obviously I think most of us would struggle with and be challenged with. One is the amount of resources you need to go work with these medical device manufacturers. So you can build a questionnaire, but then you need some sort of tool that will help you actually manage that conversation and that relationship with the medical device manufacturers, and then ultimately qualify and quantify that risk that they may present by bringing that device. The second area that's always a challenge is, and I'll just put this out there because I don't work for a hospital, so I can say this and most of you probably can't, is there's always that cardiologist out there that says, that threatens the revenue or plays the revenue card, right? Like either I get that new cool blah, blah, blah device, or I'll take my business elsewhere. And the C-suite reacts by saying, hey, wait a minute, we have to have that device. And that's where policy again helps, because having those policies that are signed off by your C-suite and your board specific to medical devices provides everybody with that tool to say, look, we can't keep doing that in the future because this represents a serious impact or potential impact to patient safety and possibly patient life. So that's the policy and governance side. And one of the key things we would always tell everybody is kind of, here's 2 big things. The second bucket is the security architecture. And yes, we would recommend typically in a report after doing an assessment, some form of device segregation. Now, obviously, we know that most hospitals can't afford to just go suddenly deploy segregated networks throughout their organization. It's a complex problem to solve. So what we do recommend, though, is taking baby steps, having some form of plan that over the next 2 to 3 years, you can get to a point where you maybe just segregate your medical devices. And what we recommend in this area is that the first thing you do is focus on your life support devices, right? Those devices that are critical to supporting life. If they stop, a human is going to be impacted drastically. And then secondly, once you have those segregated, look at your diagnostic devices, those that are from a diagnostic perspective but may not be impacting or supporting life on a moment-by-moment basis. So that lets you kind of take a crawl, walk, run perspective. And remember, when if you ever do go through a breach and somebody's investigating or auditing you, whether it's the regulatory side or the civil liability side, they're going to be looking for, did you know you should do this? And if you did, were you trying to do something about it? And as long as you can truly demonstrate that, look, we were trying. We may not have been able to do this overnight, but we have a plan in place. That's really an important thing to take away. The second thing is in the security architecture is how you're integrating threat intelligence. And so obviously you want to either subscribe to open source feeds or join things like we provide a threat intelligence program and it's free. And so we can, so there's just what threat intelligence are you looking at? How do you know that your smart pumps or your MRIs are, and for this model and make, are vulnerable to something or under attack. I mean, a few weeks ago, we had the orange worm attacks that specifically went after public-facing radiology and lab equipment. So how would you learn about that so that you could take steps to kind of shut those things down or block traffic to it or whatever you wanted to do? And then the last piece is this bucket around security operations. And typically what we talk about here is putting in place some type of device monitoring, something that is specifically looking at your medical devices and watching for possible network traffic or intrusions against those devices. One of the big things that we've talked about lately with people, and is really becoming very popular, it's actually resonating very well, is deploying honeypots within your environment. And we recommend this whether we're talking about medical devices or not. But specifically dropping honeypots that can replicate medical devices is a really great practice. And then device risk and vulnerability assessment, right? You still need to do an assessment of your medical devices, at least some form of representative sample. So if you have 1,000 or 10,000 devices or 60,000, you want to pick 50 or 100 devices and then go out and say, okay, we're going to at least scan these and do an assessment of risk on these devices so we can get a representative sample of what the overall risk is in our organization. And then you want to have some form of specific device incident response, meaning that if a device comes under attack or if there is a situation with a device, how do you handle that? And that should probably have a different set of protocols from an incident response perspective than you would for, say, your EMR or your domain controllers, because obviously if somebody's attacking your life support devices, you may need to take some very special care about how you do that. And that incident response may require involvement of clinical staff and contingencies related to how you're going to support life if your life support devices are under attack. So this is everything you should be doing. And I can tell you, in doing these assessments, starting in 2015, whether I visit your hospital or not, or my team visits your hospital or not, or Jerry's team visits your hospital or not, this is pretty much what we're going to tell you. And we kind of had an aha moment with this when we were going through this. But this is kind of the best practices we find that need to be deployed across, regardless of hospital side, when it comes to medical device security. So you can go to the next slide here. So that kind of brought us to, well, why did we even develop MDCOP? And it really comes down to a few things. What we started seeing happen was that somebody would call us in, or somebody else, a competitor or whoever it may be, and they perform an assessment, very similar to what we do. I mean, at the end of the day, there's only so many ways to do an assessment and still consider it a best practice-based assessment. And so you perform the assessment, somebody writes up a report and does a presentation for you, you review the results and the recommendations, and what we found is in most cases, the recommendations and the results with some very minimal kind of difference were always the same. And we felt that wasn't really the way to operate from a position of integrity, that there's no honor in charging people to go do assessments when we already know the answers. In fact, in the past 2 slides, I already told you what we would probably find if we came out to your organization and what we would recommend. So what happens then? Well, if you can just hit the space bar on this, I think there's a bill there. So what we find is that the average cost to just do the assessment, depending on the size of your hospital and complexity, but an average, let's say 200 to 400 bed hospital is going to be about $25,000 to $35,000, right? And so, you know, and so that's just the medical device assessment. And what happens at that point is now you're left with the recommendations, which I went through with you on the last slide, that you now have to deploy. And we thought, well, there's got to be some better way to do this, because it's kind of silly if, as an industry, we all know the answers, but we kind of have to get the check mark that we went through the assessment, spend the money. And honestly, frankly, being totally transparent, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense to be lining the pockets of a lot of vendors to just come in and do assessments when they already know the answer. So this is why we invented MDCOP. We basically said that, okay, well, can't we just jump to the answer? If we already know it, why are we charging people for kind of going to the dance? So that's where MDCOP came from. So if we go to the next slide, we'll kind of take you through what MDCOP does. So MDCOP has basically within the product, so you can obviously, if you don't want to do MDCOP, you can go do all the stuff I told you about earlier in the deck on your own. And put together all those pieces and make it happen. And that's totally cool, and it's in line with best practices. But if you're in a situation where you don't have the resources, you need to figure out how you're going to manage these things on an ongoing basis, and economically you're trying to figure out how to make this all work, that's where MDCOP comes in, right? MDCOP and MDCOP Plus kind of bring together the three buckets that we talked about. It provides you with the ability to do policy and governance, security operations, and security architecture. And I'll take you briefly through how we do that. So next slide. So basically the three buckets, policy, governance, security architecture, security operations, what we do in MDCOP is we provide you with a pre-written policy. Now we put this together based on the outcomes of our assessments. We give you the policy, which includes practices and specific to medical devices. So you get to check the box on that, take that, work with your general counsel, and you have a running start. You can obviously edit it, change it, do whatever you need, but it gives you a foundation. We've taken that to attorneys, and when we've gotten quotes for it, we've been told that depending on the attorney, it would cost you anywhere from $7,500 to somewhere near $20,000, depending on the attorney, to write the policy for you. So that's part of MDCOP out of the box. And so the second thing we give you is the vendor assessment framework. And now this was developed out of the Medical Device Task Force. And it's basically 120 questions. And so the policy states that you should have an ongoing way of assessing risk by your vendors, and then the vendor assessment framework helps you actually have the questions you need. Now those 120 questions are based on a cross-section of all types of medical devices. And the idea is that you can send that to your vendors during the purchasing process, or for those vendors you already have in-house, and say, hey, we want you to fill this out. Now, that is a challenge, right, in and of itself, and that's kind of where we started working with ComplyAssistant on helping kind of take this to the next level. And Jerry's going to talk more about that, but the basic MDCOP program basically gives you the 120 questions. But at least you have that kind of orange bucket of policy and governance starting to kind of be foundationally dealt with from the MDCOP perspective. The second thing we do is we do work with you to get you the best practices around how to segregate your network, how to put that long-term plan in place, what you need to do to figure out so that, you know, you may not be able to do it all overnight, but you need to have some plan. And so part of what we do is help you deal with that and figure out how to make the best practices. And what we find, honestly, a lot of times it's just cultural understanding of figuring out how to segment those networks and to do it in an economical manner. Now, I want to be clear, we don't segment your network for you. We're basically helping provide the best practices, the coaching and the consulting around what steps you should take to get there. We also work on an evolve and replace strategy. So I mentioned that about 60% of the devices we see have end of life. Again, you have to have some plan. You may not economically be able to replace 60% of your medical devices, or even 10% of them in any small period of time, but you still need to have some form of plan. And so depending on what you have in your inventory, you need to have a plan that is specific to that. So we also help kind of develop that recommendation and that plan for you. It obviously, we include a membership in the ISAO. So as part of joining this, you get the ISAO membership. And the second part of that is you get the threat intelligence briefings that come out of our Security Operations Center. So that automatically is included in the program. And then the next piece of this is the security operations. So what we include is 8x5 monitoring of up to 1,000 devices through our Security Operations Center. We deploy an IDS, and I'll get more into that in a little bit, but we we basically provide the monitoring of the devices. Now we start with 1,000 because the concept behind MDCOP is a crawl, walk, run kind of program where you deploy it, you see if you're getting value from it. If you are, then great, we can add more devices. We don't have an upper limit on it. And if for some reason it's not right for you, then you can shut down the program pretty simply. We also deploy something called the Nightingale BDA. This is our product. It's a breach detection agent. They're kind of like honeypots. And so we deploy that with 2 agents to help you replicate medical devices. So it's a pretty holistic offering from policy to architecture to operations. So next slide. So, from our perspective, it's a pretty comprehensive product, MDCOP itself. We based it on the assessment learnings. We think it's economical. You can pay somewhere between $25,000 to $35,000 just to do the assessment itself, and then have to go do everything else. In this case, we basically, the MDCOP program averages out to be about $45,000 or so. The MDCOP plus fees, which ComplyAssistant brings to the table with their offering, is as an additional set of fees. But overall, we think it's rather economical because it's kind of hopefully a single platform best of breed offering that's based on real world learning and understanding of what happens in this space. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the technology behind MDCOP. We're not going to go real deep into this, but I'll give you an idea of the different pieces so you kind of have a sense of that. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jerry. So our Security Operations Center, basically what we do is we deploy VMs to your environment for the intrusion detection to monitor the devices. Those are monitored. So the one difference we have from some of the other people out there trying to monitor medical devices is, yes, we take information and alerts and everything are set back to the cloud, and we can get deeper into that. But ultimately, there are humans watching what's happening. So yes, we can automatically, we have correlation engines and all the kind of stuff that you would expect from a monitoring platform that's part of a security operations center, but we also have humans. And when things go south, something may happen if you do get breached on your medical devices. Being able to pick up the phone and being talk to someone and say, what do you guys think? What do you think we should do? How should we handle this? Even if you know how to handle it and you just want someone to kind of help provide some high level overwatch, that's part of the program. And so it's not just deploying some technology to you and saying, hey, good luck with that, and we'll provide updates as we go. It's also saying there are going to be humans that deal with medical device security pretty much every day, day in and day out, helping you kind of figure out how to go forward. Next slide. Now, what we deploy is our Nightingale intrusion detection system. I'll get much further. We can talk more about this, but not to bore everybody. Our IDS is a little different. It's based on a telecom grade intrusion detection system. So we can deploy this. It's clusterable. It's extremely scalable. It's designed to be deployed on telecoms. So it's based on an open source set of code. We've added a bunch of stuff to it specific to medical devices. One of the things we're doing is DHCP fingerprinting, which allows us to automatically identify most devices, whether they're medical devices or Xboxes or whatever they may be. So that's included. We have an asset inventory detection system that we've put in place, and that actually helps us to understand the device inventory that you have over time. We've integrated threat intelligence into it automatically, and we automatically update and deal with any kind of issues with it remotely, so you don't have to manage the device or the deployment of the IDS. And you can export our logs to anything you want, from other SIMs to anything you really want. Next slide. So you could do the build on this. So we kind of, if you can hit the space bar, Jack.
Yep.
So thank you. So we kind of found that, hey, over the past few years, that number 315, if you hit the space bar again, represents the amount of days that a breach goes on without being detected. And that's a problem, because that means we're getting very close to almost a year before a breach is actually detected, on average across industries, not just healthcare. And what we found is that the time to detect a breach, and if you hit the space bar, we can see that is kind of right here. When attackers get into your network, one of the first things they're going to do is some form of reconnaissance or vulnerability assessment. We all do vulnerability assessments as part of our compliance requirements, but attackers do the same thing. And this is when you need to start really catching them. And so we started thinking about this. Sensato, we have a very strong attacker's perspective. Most of us are attackers, and so our DNA comes from that. And we started wondering, if you go to the next slide, how do we deal with this 315-day issue, and why are people staying in networks so long when we have IDSs and IPSs and antivirus and firewalls and NIST 853 and HIPAA? We're doing all these things, but attackers still keep getting in, and not just getting in, they're hanging out. So we kind of asked ourselves as attackers, what scares us? When we go do pen tests, what really scares us? What's one thing we can't really get around? And we also went out and reached out to a whole bunch of other attackers that we know. Some are quite famous, some are quite notorious, some are not really the people you'd want to invite over for dinner. And one answer came back more often than not, that the one thing that scares them when they intrude into a network is this. And if you hit the space bar, and it's a real simple answer, is honeypots. Right, because the way a honeypot works is as soon as you touch it, it doesn't try to analyze you. It's not doing pattern recognition or AI or ML or any of that. It's simply saying somebody touched me and I shouldn't have been touched, and it raises an alert. And that kind of helps, because the moment an attacker gets in your network and they start nmapping or doing a traversal or running pings or ARPs or sweeps, they're going to stumble across a honeypot. And so we're real big fans of it, to the point where we said, well, we should go build one. And that's one of the other things that we include in MDCOP. So if you go to the next slide, is our BDA product, our breach detection agent. This is kind of a screenshot of it. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but go to the next slide. Basically, the way it works, if you have an attacker on your network, and if you hit the space bar, and you've deployed our BDA product, our Nightingale agent, at that point, when the attacker starts doing their reconnaissance, the Nightingale agent appears to be as any other machine. So if the attacker is just looking, say, for a specific type of medical device, then it's going to detect that. It's going to appear like that medical device, and it's going to detect the fact that somebody is trying to interact with it when they shouldn't be interacted with. And obviously, the BDA could be any kind of computing device. In this case, for MDCOP, they're being deployed as medical devices. Next slide. Keep going. And keep going. And so the BDA product that we have, it's included with MDCOP. It's actually very simple to deploy. You can deploy it within less than 30, 40 minutes. It's easy to manage. You can tie this into our Security Operations Center, or you can manage it. It can, aside from the dashboard, which we call the Nest, you can get emails and SMS messages. There's a bunch of stuff that we do in it. We're adding new features to it around countermeasures and forensics that I won't go into here. But our concept was to take kind of honeypots and evolve them to the next level, something that can be professionally, commercially deployed and integrated with other products. Next slide. In terms of how we deploy MDCOP overall, including the policies and everything part of it, we start with a kickoff meeting. We confirm the objectives. We put you through something called the CTOC Connect program, which is typically a one-day planning session of how do we connect your environment to our Security Operations Center, and we put together a specific plan for that. So there's basically the overall product plan for MDCOP, and then there's the CTOC, or the Security Operations Center project plan that we put together. We then move into a deployment phase where we get you copies of the policies, the vendor assessment stuff. If you're working with ComplyAssistant, which we highly recommend you would do, then we would bring them into the fold and kind of make sure that all your questions and everything from a ComplyAssistant standpoint are there. We then deploy the BDAs, we deploy the CTOC, and we do some strategic planning at the end of this phase. And then we transition to a run, kind of we basically are live at that point. And so we will do a vulnerability assessment on a representative sample of your devices. We'll do governance monitoring. We help with threat intelligence, and we'll continue to provide you threat intelligence. And then obviously, if there is an incident, we'll help respond to that and provide some guidance on what you should be doing and how you should be dealing with those situations. So next slide. So that's kind of everything behind MDCOP, which if you could think about it as the foundation, but there's still this problem that we're providing you with this questionnaire of 120 questions, and you certainly could try to deal with that on your own, but it becomes exponentially a very large challenge, because if you have one vendor, maybe it's not too hard to deal with 120 questions, but when you start dealing with 5, 10, 50, 60, 100 different medical device vendors, or even all your BAs, if you wanted to extend this beyond just the medical device folk, it becomes really unwieldy and difficult to deal with. And so based on the feedback we've gotten from others, we turned to ComplyAssistant. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jerry, because they've kind of put the plus in MDCOP as to kind of bring their solution to the table. So Jerry and Ken.
Okay, thanks, John. And John, you kind of said everything I needed to say, so thank you. That was great. Yeah, basically, we are the plus in MDCOP Plus for value add for MDCOP. We do include the 120 medical device vendor question set, as John mentioned. So as a client, and many of you attending today are clients, you have access to that 120 question set. So, if you don't have that already in your account, we can add it in minutes, so you'll have it available to you. I believe John mentioned that it has been vetted by vendors, the medical device vendors, MITRE, the research company in New Jersey, the FDA, and a number of hospital associations, including the New Jersey Hospital Association. And so one very important factor is that MDVs do have motivation to include their results from these audits based on the 120 question set being vetted. So by going through the audit and getting the results into the ISAL, there is potential for reduced liabilities in the event of an incident. And the results, the reports, once approved to be added to the ISAL by the vendors, can be more easily shared with other healthcare organizations that join the ISAL. Now, from a managed service standpoint, there's the option to outsource all MDV audits to ComplyAssistant or use the portal on their own as a client, or a combination of both. Today, many healthcare organizations are struggling with budgets and resources and find it difficult to address a potentially high volume projects such as auditing third-party BA vendors, including MDVs. Some try to use Word or Excel, and that becomes difficult to manage, as John mentioned. So instead of that approach, our clients can use the portal to manage the process in a more structured way, and reap the benefits of automatic alerts and notifications with more efficient management by exception overall. And we have clients who have decided to outsource the entire process to us, as I mentioned, and some have a combined approach. So some may want to individually vet new vendors in pre-contract phase for approval, and they may hand over to us the existing vendors that are in a high risk category, maybe 50 to 100, simply because they don't have the resources and time to do it on their own. So when we do it, you can see the bullets of what's comprised in the managed service. Pretty much we are providing all of the administration from A to Z, all the monitoring, the setup, education, the help desk. We are risk rating the answers. We're reviewing evidence documentation from the vendors. And as a result of the combination of answers, notes, and evidence that we review, we can issue a final report with the ratings for both the MDV and also to the healthcare organization covered entity. Upon MDV approval, the final report can then be added to the Sensato ISAL. So here's just an example alert. This happens to be the initial email that goes to the vendor with instructions on how they can begin to take the assessment. This is what they see when they first log in after credentialing. Again, they have the instructions and they can click to start the assessment. The instructions are repeated, and then they have question 1, and they begin to go through the 120 questions with the answers. They can put in notes, and they can attach evidence documentation that we can then review. There's also monitoring by exception, so we can see progress on the management side. We can see when the assessment is due, when it was created, when it was last updated, who was assigned to, and then the percent complete. And on the toggle that Ken can show you in his demo, we can automatically remind the vendors to continue if they are running late. So there's all kinds of ways of having notifications to the vendor. And the one thing we found too is when a vendor is working in an electronic structured way, and they know it's being monitored automatically with alerts, notifications, reminders, it's not an Excel file that they may forget about and have a hard time to get to and struggle working with it. It's right in front of them. and they are more motivated to get it done. We've had really good success with vendors completing, the audit in a timely manner, and we can, again, by exception management, be able to manage the ones who need to get nudged. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken, so he can begin to. Let me just get Ken on here. So Ken, now you can do the demo, and you can take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jerry.
Yeah.
Everyone should be able to see my screen now, and this is the assessments function for the ComplyAssistant software. Now, it's the assessments function can handle both internal and external assessments, meaning you can do assessments of your organization as well as third parties, business associates, medical device vendors, as previously mentioned. So we have a demo account here with some listed. So we have a few medical device vendors, we have some third parties, we have an organization here as well. So you can see how they would be listed in the software. And as Jerry mentioned before, we would take your list and upload it into the software for you, and then help you manage the process going forward. So that would be assigning the assessment out to the third party contact, following up with them, making sure they are completing the assessment, and that's in addition to the automatic reminders that come from the software. So the automatic reminders consist of one that goes out when it's assigned. They get an updated email every 2 weeks, and then we can push notifications as well, which I'll show in a couple of minutes. So if we drill down into one particular assessment, and we'll use the medical device vendor one down here, we can see that the assessment was created by me on August 21st and is due on September 6th. It was assigned to William Jones here. It looks like William has completed 10 of the 120 questions. We can see that both from the progress bar and then the 10 of 120 that's listed over here. If you wanted to nudge the third party and remind them about the assessment, you can do so by using the caret over here. You can continue the assessment from here, and I'll show you what the third party contact would see. So this is the question and answer interface. They would have the question up at the top. They would have the ability to choose an answer here, put their notes, and we also have each question relating to a part of the HIPAA security rule. And here's a rule reference tab as well. So if they wanted some additional backup as to why we're asking this question, it's really in reference to this rule. And then lastly, they can attach supporting documentation down at the bottom, and then choose their answer and move on to the next question. So if we come back out here, we will get a notification when the assessment is complete, and then it would be up to us to come in and review the assessment for answers, any notes, and then additional documentation that supports that answer and note field. We would come up with a risk and documented evidence level. So what we're looking at now is the assessment report, and we have some demographic information at the top, and this matches that initial email that Jerry mentioned before. We have that there. We have an assigned date, a due date, percentage complete, a priority of the assessment, and then the assignee and who assigned it. We scroll down a little further. We have some pie graphs here that get filled out as you complete the review of the assessment. So we have a documented evidence. We have risk here. You can see the average down below. Scrolling down a little further, we have the answers. So how the question was answered here, who answered the question, how many remaining, answers with notes, answers with attachments. And then we have a rule risk breakdown. So as I mentioned before, each one of the questions relates back to a part of the HIPAA security rule. So we have a crosswalk here that shows the HIPAA security rule and the risk associated with it. And then below that, we have the tasks that were created. So any gaps that were found, we create mitigation action items for the third party to follow up on. This is our email log, which is underneath the rule risk breakdown. So you can see how the emails are actually communicating with third party. We have a green check mark here, so it shows that it's delivered successfully. We also have a notification if there's a bounce. You'd see a red exclamation point, and you'd also get an email about that as well to go back and make sure you have the right email address on file. Here we have the question. You'll see the answer, the notes, the attachments you can review, and here's where you would rate the risk. So this is where we would rate risk down here. And we have a risk from 1 to 100, low being 1 and 100 being high. Documented evidence. We have our tasks here we can actually write comments back and forth with the third-party contact. So we could ask them questions about their answer, and then we can communicate directly through the application as opposed to going out and doing it through an email. So we would then continue down for the rest of the questions, and each question would get a rating, possibly a task, and then some notes communicating back and forth with the third party. When it is complete, we have the ability to do a couple types of reports. You can do one, an action item report, so you can see all of the action items that are related to this assessment. You can also do a summary to PDF report. I can show you what that looks like. We'll do a summary to PDF. So this would be something that you could take to a meeting. It's a high-level document that shows just the graphs and the high-level ratings that were done. So open that up, and you get the demographics as well as the question summary. And then you have the rule risk breakdown with the tasks here. We also have a full version of the report, and that can be done in PDF, Excel, and CSV exports, and then different types of filters that you can run on the report. So coming back out to the assessment function, you can then see all of the locations that do have an assessment and tell the progress by the bar here. You can also do it in the definitions view. So if you have a couple different types of definitions, one for BAs for HIPAA, for example, and then one for medical device vendors, we have a couple ways of looking at these and organizing these on our end. And then from the assessments function, you can also run reports and export to PDF, Excel, and CSV over here. We have lots of different filtering capability based on assessment risk and whether or not it's active. We can do facility, department, third-party location, category, all different types of filtering we can run from the assessment function. So with that, Jerry, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I was just wondering, could you show the action item report?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. We'll come back into tasks here. All of the tasks are actually stored in the task function. Mm-hmm. So we can run a medical device vendor assessment task report, and you can see it's located up here with the task group, and all of the tasks related to the assessments would be shown below. And again, in the task function, we also have the ability to sort on location. So if we have multiple third parties that we're assessing, we can drill down into the correct one over here and then update the results. Now we have only the task for that particular third party. And then on the third-party contacts view, as Jerry showed before on the slide, they would have the ability to answer the tasks and also see the risk rating that was assigned to them. So they could respond to the tasks down the road if they needed to do so. Jerry, did you have anything else, or?
No, that's great. And once a task goes into the task function, it follows the same routine, which is upon assignment, the notifications go out to the third party. When it becomes pending within 7 days, there's a reminder that it's pending. When it becomes overdue, there's reminders, and those reminders will occur every week until the task is completed. And so that kind of automated management occurs within the task function. And like Ken said, you can also put in comments that go to the third party as well. So basically, what we tried to do here was design a GRC tool that results in enterprise collaboration, exception management, and automation wherever possible, because we are talking high volume, as John mentioned, and as I also repeated as well, because it's very important to note, in a high volume project like this, it is difficult to use unstructured files. It's much more manageable in a structured tool like this. And since many of you today attending our clients, you do have the tool. So now you can consider all of the rest of the components that John mentioned in MDCOP. And you can also consider adding the 120 question set. If you haven't done so already, we will set that up for you right away. And we'll go from there. So Ken, do we have any questions from today?
Let me just check here. It doesn't look like we have any.
Okay. I guess that means we did a good job, and that's probably what it means. We did a great job today. So now, after the fact, so let me let me take back presenter. In the, let me see here. Got to go over to here. Come back here, show my screen. And so here's the contact information for both ComplyAssistant and Sensato. And after this webinar, at any time, if you do have questions, you can reach out to us at any time and ask the questions. We'll be happy to answer them. And feel free to get in touch with both of our companies at any time for any reason. John, did you have any comments as well as we end this webinar?
No, just want to say thank you and appreciate everybody's time in attending, and really thank you guys for putting this together.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Ken, and thanks everyone for attending. And we'll get the recording and the PDF out to you by tomorrow. Have a great day.